members of the press, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It gives me a real pleasure to address the local and international media this evening. Let me avail of this opportunity to brief you on the insight of this very important event taking place in Mauritius during this week. Africa disaster risk reduction communities have gathered for the 6th session of the Africa Regional Platform on Disaster Risk Reduction between the 22nd to 24th November, followed by the 5th high-level ministerial meeting with the disaster risk reduction to be held on the 25th November 2016. I wish to thank the Regional Office for Africa United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reductions, UNISDR, for selecting Mauritius as host country for this regional event. We are proud as a member of the African family to bring together 35 ministers and more than 400 delegates from the African continent and beyond to renew their commitments to the implementation of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015-2030 in Africa. The world is witnessing a drastic increase in the frequency of intensity of disasters, and this is being aggravated by climate change. Between 2005 to 2015, Africa lost more than 100,000 lives, and over 20 million people have been directly affected due to the estimated number of 185 disasters events. Mauritius, as a small island developing states, is not spared either and are being more and more exposed to such disasters. Hence the very importance of holding this session in our country. The purpose of us all meeting here during this week will be for Africa to be able to raise its concern as a continent with one common vision and one single voice. The outcome will be summarized into, first, a committed program of action for Africa. Secondly, a common Africa position for the Global Platform 2017. And thirdly, a Mauritian declaration that will be submitted to the African Union Summit in January 2017 for endorsement prior to the 5th session of the Global Platform of Disaster Risk Reduction in Cancun, Mexico in March next year. More than 184 countries unanimously signed the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015-2030 in March last year. This framework clearly provides a roadmap for global action on disaster risk reduction. However, recognizing the vulnerability and the poor resilience of our continent, it was high time that we review the progress of its implementation in the region, and from there, chart a solid agenda for Africa. The timely implementation of the Sendai Framework in Africa will be key in the overall achievement in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, including the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. With a view to reducing vulnerability and increasing countries' capacities to recover and leap forward, for 4 priorities areas have been identified with the Sendai Framework and as follows. Firstly, thoroughly understand all dimensions of disaster risk. Secondly, strengthen disaster risk governance at all levels and across all sectors. Thirdly, invest more in disaster risk reduction program to build resilience and reinforce disaster preparedness for more effective response, recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. Disaster strikes at the heart of community. This is why it is imperative that we fully engage the community groups at large. This is where the media has a key role to play, and we are making an urgent appeal to you to partner with us in this process. For this to happen, it is essential that you adopt a proximity approach with the grassroots community and speak the language. As a responsible government, Mauritius has set up 12 local disaster risk reduction and management committees, in each authority to work closely with the community to manage disaster risk. Some 50 simulation exercises have been conducted since last year to enhance the preparedness of agencies and local communities against natural disasters such as flooding, tsunamis, and landslide. I will conclude by thanking the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, the African Union Commissions, the SADC, as well as the government of Japan, the European Commission, and the IUCN for their invaluable support in the lead up to this conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honorable Minister, members of the press. We're happy to be here and to be part of this press conference. First, we'd like to thank the government and the people of the Republic of Mauritius for accepting to host this conference. And we would also like to thank the collaborative effort that a joint effort we'll be having with the UNISDR in supporting issues of disaster risk reduction in Africa. As we know that the SEDAI framework for disaster risk reduction was adopted last year in March, and following this, we met in Yaoundé for Africa to align its own program of action. So we are happy that we are implementing the decision of the African heads of state and government on the alignment of the program of action. So we expect at this meeting that the program of action will be revised and will be adopted by the ministers, so that after this, it will now serve as a basis for Africa's action in the implementation of the SEDAI framework. We are also hopeful that at this meeting, the African Common Position on the progress on the implementation of the SEDAI framework will be discussed and agreed on by the ministers, and so that we'll be able to report next year at the next global platform in Mexico. And we're also looking forward to the Mauritius Declaration, which we know that will be very, very rich and encompassing on the progress of work and even charting the way in which we implement the SEDAI framework for the next decade. And lastly, to say that we are also happy that all this is in realization of the Africa's Agenda 2063 on the Africa we want. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Mr. Glasser.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me join in extending my heartfelt thanks to the government of Mauritius for hosting this meeting, which is so critically important to develop an African response to the need to reduce disaster risk. So I really appreciate Mauritius's leadership, regional leadership in moving this forward by bringing us all together here today. I mentioned to Minister Wong a moment ago that while I was up on the podium, I don't know if anyone else heard this, there was a little baby's voice. I don't know if it was outside or whether a mother in the room had brought her baby, but it reminded me, at least it occurred in my mind as I heard that, why we're actually focusing on disaster risk. It is because Minister Wong mentioned the loss of life in Africa. Maybe just to expand this to the global level, you know, in the last 2 decades, it's something like 1.35 million lives lost from disasters, and over $2.5 trillion of economic loss. That money, so the loss of life is tragic, and often it's women and children who are most vulnerable to hazards, most exposed. And that economic cost also means money that isn't spent on educating children, on their health care, on economic development, on infrastructure that attracts businesses and investment and supports access to hospitals and schools. So for me, that little voice in the room, even though I don't know who else, maybe I imagined it, but I don't think so. You heard it as well. Yeah. It was a reminder of why this is such an important topic. And actually, if you look over the past decades, this huge loss of life and economic cost, it is really a tyranny of ignorance on disaster risk. It's not a deliberate tyranny by any means. It's just the fact that people don't recognize the huge impact of disasters and don't realize how important it is to act proactively. The international agreement, the Sendai Framework, and its predecessor, the Hyogo Framework, is ending the tyranny of ignorance on disaster risk and its huge costs. And that's why this meeting today is so important in a region such as Africa, where something like half of the world's most at-risk countries are in Africa, where the risks of drought and climate change exacerbating all of these risks, flooding, tsunami risk, where there are multiple risks affecting the continent and affecting livelihoods, is so important. Why it's so important for this meeting to organize a plan of action for all of Africa to eliminate this tyranny of ignorance and to address disaster risk through addressing disaster risk and through this important action plan and the Mauritius Declaration that we expect to be issued. So it's a wonderful thing to be working on something as important as this, and with multiple stakeholders, government, civil society, the private sector, at national level and at subnational level as well, where most of these hazards hit directly people's homes, small businesses, and the like. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Glassy. Ending the tyranny of ignorance, that's a pretty good objective for the week, I think. So we'll open the floor for questions. Who'd like to go first?
Nobody has any question?
That's easy.
No?
What is the greatest risk for Africa? Drought or flooding?
You know, disaster, up to now, we don't know what is coming up. Like, it depends on the region. Like, we know in the tropical region, like Mauritius, where we are more prone to cyclones. But we must not forget that in March 2013, we encountered a flash flood that killed more than 11 person in less than an hour. That was trapped in the pass, in the highway, in the capital of Portus itself. So the risks keep on changing. We can't concentrate on what is the most risk we have. It depends on the region, but we are going to work on different places and to make people understand that each one in each country must be prepared for disasters. And one of the figures that I heard today was like more than 60% of African population live in slums, which means these population are so much at risk. They have no way they can listen to the media. That's why today we call again for the media to please to play the game with us, to have this proximity, to keep on informing people when we have disasters, and we need to prepare for that.
Don't you think that Mauritius is facing a problem of urban planning that is one problem of floods?
It is, in fact, one of the questions that we will raise, that we need. It's everywhere. It's at large. Every single stone must be turned to see what are the preparedness we must find for tomorrow, so that we are least at risk.
I think just on the other elements of hazards in Africa, I think one that was mentioned prominently and that is clearly fundamental for Africa is drought. And we're seeing countries affected by drought. As a huge percentage of Africa as a whole is now exposed to drought and extreme temperatures as well. What we know from climate change analysis is that the general pattern we can expect from climate change is that dry places get drier and wet places get wetter. And in Africa, of course, it's not just about dry places. That has an impact on food and food security, on people movements, because if people can't eat or get enough water, they move further, as we've seen in Darfur and even in Syria, where a prolonged drought, unprecedented in modern times, over 3 years, led to hundreds of thousands of people moving from the countryside into cities. It didn't cause the Syrian crisis, but it was a contributing factor in that crisis. So it's about food insecurity and ultimately about conflict and refugees. So this is why it's so important, particularly for Africa, to address disaster risk.
We're working in short time frames, 15 years, 50 years at best, 2050. How long would it take to see an actual first step for the Sendai program? Because just for an example, the COP21 took a full year for every country to sign it. We were present. So are we taking more than a year? Are we talking a decade? Or are we talking a shorter time frame of work?
Actually, for the Sendai framework, it's 15 years. If you notice from the Yogo framework for action, it's for 15 years. But in the case of our Sendai framework, it's quite different from the climate change. In the sense that in the case of the climate change, that is negotiated and signed because parties to it sign. But in the case of the Sendai framework, this is a framework continental, and then that is all over the world. Then in Africa, we have our own program of action that based on the African Regional Strategy on Disaster Risk Reduction. And that is what we're trying to do now, that once it's adopted, it will be adopted for the next 15 years, at least till the end of the Sendai framework, which is 2030. And it's also going to be in line with this SDG 2, and also in line with the African Agenda 2063, the first 10 years. Thank you.
One question from Mr. Glasser. You rightly said that drought is the main problem in Africa, along with floods and epidemics. So why has the UN put a sensitization day on tsunami rather than on droughts?
Okay. So there are two days that UNISDR supports and facilitates. One is International Day for Reducing Disaster Risk, and another is World Tsunami Awareness Day. Both of these are days that we didn't put the emphasis on. The member states themselves in the UN established these as international days. But even for me, for tsunami risk, the thing about tsunami is that it captures people's imaginations. If you think about the images either of the Boxing Day, the Indian Ocean tsunami that affected Aceh and many countries of the world, or the Great Eastern Japan earthquake and tsunami, where you saw the water coming in and cars, families trying to get away, and it is so dramatic and traumatic, and often, particularly in vacation spots, it's not just hidden away from rich countries, because they often have tourists, people from their own countries who are exposed. So it creates an opportunity to raise awareness not just about tsunami, but also about disaster risk more generally. It's a platform. But in terms of where we put our emphasis, it's on the broad range of hazards, whether it's a nuclear reactor meltdown, or a chemical hazard, or a pandemic risk, or floods, droughts, extreme weather, volcanoes. It's quite broad and, sadly, too many hazards.
Allow me to first start by moving the microphone so that I will be able to get a clearer. Yes. Thank you. One of the biggest issues that has faced the continent this year is the issue of drought and consequent food security issues. We're being told now that up to 70 million Africans are in danger of hunger. And I think it is easy to say that we have experienced drought, but it is important that we understand why we are hungry in 2060. Is there anything else other than weather that drives the hunger in Africa? I'm sure there are places where there's more than enough food within the continent.
Thank you. Actually, we also have, at the African Union level, we have the policy, and it's a major framework called the Comprehensive African Agricultural Development Program. And this is a compact in which over almost 35 countries have signed to it. And this is helping to improve, to increase food security in Africa. And also, that's why also the heads of state also set a day apart to celebrate the the Africa Food and Security Nutrition Day, which is on the 31st of October every year. And in fact, this year was actually celebrated in Ghana just last month. So all these issues, all these policies are helping to drive, to ensure that we don't have food insecurity, and also ensuring that there's poverty alleviation in the continent. Thank you.
But in your own understanding, is there something else other than weather that drives food security problems in Africa? And secondly, you rightly mentioned about policies, and journalists in Africa do not like to hear about policies anymore, because we make very many of them. In Kenya, we make very many beautiful policies, but they end up in the shelves. They do not have an impact on people's lives. So, probably just a comment on one, what else could be driving hunger, and two, why we need to have hope in the policies that we are making. And I'm sure we'll be making commitments here as well.
Another thing that is driving that, which we can say is aggravating it, is the issue of climate change. As you know, that it's affecting temperature variability, and also even in terms of rainfall. And you know, once you don't have enough rainfall, farmers don't even know when to plant. And if you look at the many African countries, most people are dependent on this agriculture-based in terms of their work. And then when they don't have that, they don't have access to the right season to plant, do you understand? Because the temperature can change, in terms of the rainfall, precipitation also can change. So they cannot plant at the right time, and they cannot get enough yield. And that is also causing the issue of the food insecurity. Now, in terms of the policy, yes, we're still monitoring at the African Union Commission. As you know, there's the 10% Maputo decision, which says that each country in 2003 should commit at least 10% of their GDP. And I would like to say that we have seen increase of many countries now implementing that. And as we implement that with the African Vision 2063 and the Agenda 2030, I believe that things will improve. So we should have hope. Thank you.
One last question to SRSG. No. Yes, you have talked about, you have mentioned something interesting, the tyranny of ignorance. And wanted to ask, because we have an important meeting here today, and you've talked about how this entire framework is supposed to help us to reverse the tyranny of ignorance. What is the place of this conference? What do you say is the place of this conference in the lives of the ordinary people who are daily impacted by the effects of these disasters?
Yeah, it's a bit like saying, what impact does a big international meeting have on a farmer in a village? And I think actually disaster risk, one of the reasons I wanted this job was because DRR is real, it's practical, it's something you can touch. You know, at international level, there are so many vague political terms and terminology that you don't even know what it is. But reducing the risk of disaster is something a farmer in a village can understand and a prime minister can understand. And it's for that reason that I think we've made huge progress. Let me give you an example from outside of the region, but there are many examples in the region as well. In Bangladesh in the 70s, there was a major cyclone that killed something like 250,000 people. During the World Humanitarian Summit, there was a similar cyclone, similar track, similar intensity, and the news story was, I don't know, it was maybe 150 people died. That was the news story, but the real news story was that 250,000 people didn't die. And the reason they didn't die was because Bangladesh, mostly the government itself, with its community, with civil society, supported by donors in the UN, began evacuation, early warning, storm shelters, a whole flood control, a whole variety of measures that meant actually you see the improvement. Similar storms, you can see the improvement. And these are generally often very poor people, poor farmers, rice growers or others that are affected. So for me, this is what is so exciting about risk reduction. There's this tyranny of ignorance, but as soon as you lift the veil, you can make huge progress really fast in saving lives. It's harder to make progress in decreasing the economic cost. And if you want, we can answer that. But I think there's a really good success story and a long way to go. But there are many examples of good progress because it's real,
Thank you, David. Would anybody else like to ask a question or sort of
One last question. We cannot deny the link between disasters, drought especially, and flood, and climate change. There is a link. And there has been a rise in anti-climate change lobby, climate skeptics. Is that going to have an impact on what we are trying to pull, you are trying to pull now, especially with a certain election lately? Who's a climate skeptic? Is the climate skeptic lobby doing something or counter-pushing the action?
It's more to UN.
Okay.
I leave it here.
First of all, everything we're doing to reduce disaster risk, almost everything, not every, certainly climate and health, pandemic risk, all of that will be overwhelmed no matter how much we invest now if we don't prevent runaway greenhouse gases, if we don't reduce greenhouse gases as quickly as possible. It is probably the single most critical risk treatment globally to reduce greenhouse gases. Of course, a country like Mauritius, a small island developing state, or low-lying SIDS, coral atolls, it's a matter of the survival of the very country and the history and the culture. So for me, it is the most fundamental issue. Secondly, one thing I'm certain of is that the evidence is just growing the longer we wait. We see more drought, we see more extreme weather, we see fisheries moving because the ocean temperatures change, we see corals bleaching. You see the spread of bark beetle in Canada now because the temperature, it's getting warmer and it's destroying forests and contributing to forest fires in Canada. So there are skeptics, and there have been for a long time. I don't even like to use the word skeptics. They're denying the reality in the face of the science, the really solid science. And so I think over time, they will come round. We have ups and downs on this politically, but the science is really overwhelming. And the skeptics are not basing their skepticism on science. They may base it on other things, their belief systems, or the way they wish the world was rather than the way it is. So ultimately, I think, sadly, this is not going away quickly, in spite of the efforts of the denialists, climate.
If I may add to that.
I just asked Mr. Cardoso to join us. No, please. I know you were delayed by...
No, it's not Mr. Cardoso. It's not Mr. Cardoso.
Oh, no, it's not.
Yeah.
And if I can add to that about the climate skeptics, is that the sixth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change will soon be released. It was just, the outline was just adopted in Bangkok last month. And this will guide in terms of the climate science. That's number one. Then number two, if you look at the way it is right now, all the countries is binding on every country. The Paris Agreement does not leave any country out. And that means every country that has ratified it, they no longer have high indices. They now have nationally determined contribution. That means it's a commitment of the government. And it's the commitment of the government. Every country is expected to implement its obligation because this is a multilateral agreement and forum in which there's transparency and there's consistency. So this, even with the climate skeptics, this would bring everybody on board. That even if there's skeptics, they would come back and see the reality, just as His Excellency said. Thank you.
Exactly like we said, because there is skepticism because they don't see the reality. Is that the small factors that each of us, the action that we are doing, we do understand that we are creating climate change. Like somebody doesn't want to sacrifice. One year I got an empty bottle of water. He just says, why shall I keep it in my pocket? It's only one bottle. I throw it. I don't see it. It's like the story I'm telling you. If you ask somebody to stand on a building and jump, you will die. He would understand. But if you take somebody to some small powder and you tell him, taste it, you might die. He don't believe it to you because he doesn't see it. This is what climate change. Climate change is the action of each person to be responsible, to make the sacrifice, and to have the discipline to do it. And nowadays, everybody has to take that commitment.